Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Muller, and I'm the Director of Collaborative Impact at Mindful Materials. And I'm excited to talk to you today because a lot of what my role at Mindful Materials has been is trying to think about, taking all of the work that's happened over the last 7 years, I guess, of what Mindful Materials has become, and thinking about how we take that into the future and considering the messaging and how we start to talk about these things, and also how we are really serving each one of the groups that we work with. So I'm second on that list. And then many of you, I'm sure, know Annie Bevan, who is the executive director who took over earlier this year. And Rachel Birkin, out on leave right now, is our head of membership and sponsorship. So I think a big piece of the conversation today is really sort of a reintroduction of mindful materials and, speaking to and thinking about, ideally with all of you, why does mindful materials exist? What does it do? And where is it headed in terms of how we can support the A&D community? And then, asking for your support, because mindful materials is essentially a volunteer-led, industry-led effort. Before I go any further, just a reminder for everybody to mute your mics if you're not right now. So I think, in terms of kicking off the conversation, all of us are probably incredibly aware of the enormous impact of materials at a global, industry, and individual level, and therefore the difficulty of really tackling this issue, and how that really leads to a place where we need a tool and a collaborative and a movement like mindful materials. Certainly this is a global systemic issue that's incredibly hard to tackle, and there aren't really global standards for how we start to approach material selection with holistic sustainability standards. At an industry level, I think, if you've been in the industry for a long time and have been thinking about materials, you've seen that there's been an incredible amount of action from firms and nonprofits and companies and certifications galore and so much data, but a lot of that action has been siloed, and I think really can lack ongoing collaboration across those different stakeholder groups. And so you kind of get a few winners, a few leaders in that field, but still we're really only kind of scratching the surface of who is involved in this conversation and taking action. And then on an individual level, really there's so many spreadsheets, and I know because I worked on a living building project, that was how I got into this whole field, and everybody is sort of often starting from scratch, trying to figure out what sustainability looks like for materials, where to find them, going and searching for people's SDSs and all that kind of stuff. And I think what we've seen is that we're all redoing the same work. We need to get a larger group of people involved in this, and we need to sort of let the leader sort of push far beyond. But nobody should be starting from scratch at this point with everything that we know about materials. And I think Jack Dinning had said it to me, best when we were talking about mindful materials and this idea of this global and systemic issue, and we're all trying to solve it as individuals, but it's virtually impossible to manage the data and sift through all this information and learn everything you have to know by yourself. And so mindful materials really exists because the only way that we're actually going to solve this is by working together. Materials with sustainability documentation are still rare in building stock, and even within a building that has a sustainability certification, it might be quite rare as well. And so incumbent materials, the ones that keep getting used again and again without that documentation, win. And then if you're a manufacturer who's trying to push for sustainability, you're not seeing the return on investment, you're not seeing that feedback that you need, rather than our vision, which is that regardless of green building certification, everybody should be looking to use materials that we know are better for humans, for the environment. And so we really want to make mindful materials clear to identify, easy to find, and the standard for every building. So as we were kind of saying, everything sort of started with this very simple, easy to read label created by HKS, who saw that, they needed a way to bring together all of these different certifications in the market. And that label for libraries has evolved and expanded significantly. But a big shift that also happened was in 2017 when it became an online database, with connected data, so that all of a sudden you could build APIs and have this information flow in there, and you don't have data that constantly needs to be updated or crossing out things on labels. But I think that where we have gone since then, and sort of the vision for it, that database is central. But for me, what I've kind of learned is that it's really kind of the pieces that go beyond that, the idea that materials really need a voice in the industry. And I think that mindful materials has and should continue to be that voice. I think that there are a lot of buildings focused organizations, which is incredible to be thinking at that macro level. But materials, I mean, as we all know, it's like an entire world in and of itself. And we need them to have a voice, to have an advocate, to have an educator that's really collaborating with all of the critical groups. And so that's what I see, is that the collaboration piece of this, and the opening up of this tool to the entire industry, and the way that the different volunteers have come together to collaborate on the requirements for the database and conducting education advocacy, that is what makes mindful materials what it is. It's about that collaboration piece, because we can have as much education and innovation and demand, but if we keep redoing the same work over and over, we're not really going to get any farther. So the way that we've been talking about it is really this idea of having a collaborative hub. I'll kind of get into the details of that, working on a common framework, which is all sort of powering this curated and connected library. The collaborative hub is many things, but I think it's kind of important to understand, like, who is behind mindful materials, how does it work, where do the entry requirements for the database come from, all of those pieces. And there's a number of different structures in there, but overall, this is an industry-led initiative here. It's owned and led by industry, and I think that's really what sets it apart. I think it's also what allows for this cross-pollination of ideas, this cross-collaboration between different industries. And so if you're on this call and you're interested or you're involved in mindful materials, you are a part of making that. In addition to, just sort of the broad community, we have a series of working groups, which I'll talk a little more about later, from those helping us to conduct outreach, to get more materials into the library or spread the word around mindful materials, in addition to our content and portal working groups, which are working to, constantly update and evolve the requirements of the library and how people interface with using that database. So once again, the idea that, these requirements aren't coming from somewhere in a bubble. They are really pulled from everywhere in industry and from the people who have been really working on this for years and years in a community of learning and sharing. In addition to that, we have member owners and a steering committee who are the different companies and organizations that are financially invested and really, invested personally in the success of this organization, and believe that it is an incredible tool for transforming how we think about materials on every project. In addition to that, we have an enormous manufacturing community. But, it seems worth pointing out that our manufacturing sponsors are additionally those who are really leading the conversation around material sustainability and working hard to meet the demand from the A&D community. The database and our collaboration also goes far beyond the US. We have collaboration hubs in Canada, in Latin America and the Caribbean, in China, and in India. 3 of those are actually pretty nascent, so that's been exciting this year. And then Europe and Oceania will be added next year. So I have an inability to not draw things. So this is kind of how I picture everything, you know, sort of pulling everything together, all these industry definitions, all of the leadership, industry associations and certifications together in one place and making sense of that, organizing it, creating a framework around that. And so the framework is what I want to talk about next. Collaboration is great, but you sort of have to be building something together and across all of these different industries, really be speaking in the same language. And I think that's a big part of what Mindful Materials does and where we are headed with our work. Having that common framework allows us to speak with the same language and in line action with intent. And I think that a lot of A&D have also recognized that recently, that with the AIA materials pledge that we'll talk about, in terms of really trying to lay out where is it all going instead of sort of asking for piecemeal pieces of documentation, of proof of sustainability. And how can we start to sort of use the same framework, the same terms, so that, you know, we know that we are meeting the demand, and when that's met, we can get that information back to manufacturers. And the same goes certainly for owners and contractors as well, and everybody else who is involved in that process. And that framework, there's a lot of pieces of that framework, for the very granular to the overarching, but that kind of overarching framework has really come from, I think, a huge amount of knowledge in the industry, and certainly from the AIA Materials Pledge, which I believe was published in 2019, and called out all of these different facets of health and sustainability, so that A&D felt like they could sort of ask for all of this and say, listen, I know that we're not all here at this point. I know that not everybody even knows what a product that supports social health and equity looks like, but that's where we want to go. And so what we've been doing is either directly supporting the creation of these, or supporting different industries to create their own commitment, such as the owner's commitment, and also a lighting advocacy for lighting specifiers who specifically wanted to talk to lighting manufacturers, and trying to make sure that as these get created, that everybody is really talking to each other, not creating something that sort of lives in a bubble, because these are the words that kick off the conversation, that give us intent, they give us sort of a purpose in terms of where we go. But how we follow up on that requires this alignment, so that, you know, every piece of the puzzle, every piece of the, you know, action chain in terms of building a building is aligned. So Mindful Materials is really, as part of its strategy, is not just being a database where you can go to find sustainable materials. That is a huge part of what we do, but the advocacy and the growth of these certifications, of action around material sustainability from every side, is what we want to do. If we are not out there sort of actively growing the database and growing the number of products that are being used on buildings that have sustainability attributes, then I don't think we're doing our job. And so we want to really demonstrate the power of a common language, a common framework to drive collective action. So we currently have a manufacturer engagement group and an A&D engagement group, and we'll be looking to add a contractor and owner engagement group. And I would also love to have sort of an overarching pledge group in which we can get these different groups to be talking to each other continuously, not just when something is published or at one of the various conferences. So the last piece of this, as we were talking about, is the database. And just to touch on for a minute, kind of what sets the database apart. It's really taking that framework, and we're talking about how we're going to integrate that, and building that into the database and bringing all of this information into one place. But there's a huge amount of data and criteria within each one of those categories that are defined and set by the content working group, with buy-in from the much broader set of groups within Mindful Materials. And those are, intended to be harmonized across different certifications and industry standards. So most of you are probably seeing a screenshot, and the idea of what types of documentation supports which one of these different categories in here. And the number of different certifications that are feeding into there as wild, but really trying to sort of make sense of that so that we understand how each one of these contributes to each part of that framework. And then in addition to that, we've been building these larger integrations with groups like EC3 to get carbon data automatically flowing into mindful materials, material bank as well, that can allow us to really scale the number of users, the number of products, and the number of views and hits that we have per year, ideally resulting in action. In addition to that, we're sort of always working on updating the library to make sure that it's actually used and useful for users in a way that fits with your workflow. For example, just as one example, we added multiple certification filters to search results this year. With the entire goal of being really a trusted database for materials decisions, being the easy button for finding materials that meet building certifications or that just meet the criteria that you or your firm has for how you actually want to specify materials. And looking across all of those different areas, or obviously one has the ability to really hone in on material health, for example. And so a mindful material, of course, is one which can document that it meets this library criteria based on a common sustainability framework. And what's also critical is that the submissions are reviewed by experts so that it is not just information that's sort of pulled in and scraped from the internet, but that it's curated and verified and trusted. So overall, right, we have this collaborative hub, which is building a common framework, empowering this connected and curated database. And all of those things are feeding each other so that we can grow the number of materials and the number of successes for sustainable materials and buildings, so that we can all stop redoing good work, reinventing the wheel, and kind of join the party over there. So where are we going? We just want to touch on a few points here. We have some library updates in the works, workflow integration, growing these global pledges, and really kind of growing the collaboration hub. So as I was talking about before, right now, they're actually quite similar, which is, it's interesting to see. But we're bringing this common framework that was outlined in these different materials pledges to mindful materials so that it is easy to meet the materials pledge, and it can actually be a supporting tool for demonstrating compliance with that. Or once again, for any user, for any A&D, for any owner who wants to start to make progress on these different categories of material sustainability. In addition, we have a number of database and filter updates coming, but you can see here how the different kind of buckets of sustainability are going to be updated based on that pledge. We're also working on a number of integrations, because I think what we want is not for everybody to have to come to mindful materials forever, but that the idea is that wherever you are doing your best work as an architect, as a designer, as a specifier, you should be able to go there and see information about mindful materials and see which products meet those different categories of health. We want to collaborate with as many databases as possible and just really be integrated into that workflow and make it easy and accessible. So we're also growing, as I was saying, we want to create a pledge working group, and we are actively growing these different pledges and sort of coordinating the response between all of them to make sure that they are aligned. I think what's also exciting is this question of what if, what if you could start to look at scoring for products that are in the mindful materials library? What if you could start to think about this at a project level, within an entire project? How are you actually doing? Because I think one of the critical things is, looking and just comparing materials, but at a certain point, we need to start establishing benchmarks for what good actually looks like, or what your last project actually looked like, and how are you demonstrating improvement on that? Because I think a lot of folks are interested in doing that, and somebody says, well, how'd you do on that last project? And they're like, I don't know. I mean, we got this number of products, and but being able to quantify that at a higher level and then break that down into more granular pieces is exciting. And then being able to use those results, as I said, for benchmarking, for ESG reporting, because once we can start to benchmark it, we can start to improve that. And we can also start to quantify how we're doing and then begin to reduce that, right? Because the entire point when we say to use sustainable materials is to begin to quantify what our actions mean and start to reduce our impact based on materials choices. So in terms of how different people can get involved or support this work that we're doing, one easy way to do that is to become a member and use the database. For A&D users, membership will always be free. It will always be free, which includes access to the library, participation in working groups, participation in different mindful materials events, and certainly becoming a part of that collaboration hub of industry leadership. Another big piece, frankly, is sponsoring mindful materials. And for A&D, really at whatever level is possible. But I think that if your firm believes in the idea that materials have a significant impact on humans and the environment, and want to start to make real change, category by category, product by, and then across the entire firm, sponsoring mindful materials, both in order to sort of support our growth, but also bringing a set of education and action to your whole firm. There's a series of trainings that we have, and also sort of larger integrations. So if you or you know of any firms that are interested in sponsoring mindful materials, we have our 2021 packages available now. And we would also ask that people build us into their 2022 budgets as well. One other option, I know Laurel is on here today, is to join a working group, because they really are the lifeblood of what we do. And we rely on these experts and these really passionate leaders in our working groups to create, to build these requirements, to bring together the best of the best, to bring together all of this information. And as she put it, this sort of allows her to tap into a larger network and be learning from them and be making better decisions within her own projects, and to help sort of spread the word, because that's a huge part of creating your impact. Obviously, also talking to manufacturers about mindful materials if they don't have their materials in the library already. As the library grows, as we start to integrate scoring, as we start to build in all these pieces, it's more and more important that manufacturers get this information in one place so that it's easy to access. And then the last piece is it's always fun to collaborate on events. If you have any brilliant ideas about what you're working on at your firm, or how you would love to, collaborate to talk about mindful materials. We've been putting on a series of events, which are really interesting and fun, and do reach out if you have any ideas on that. My email is below, and Annie's, and additionally membership is at the top. And I think I'm a pretty